Epstein basically became a pimp to the high and mighty. He was a procurer. He allowed them to engage in vices. Look, I've got a private island, and I've got a jet, and we can all go to my private island, and what type of things you're interested in. What do you like, and I can provide, and he would provide that for people.
Do you think it's possible that he was working for a central intelligence agency? All right, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. Now, today is a very exciting day. This podcast is long, but it's long for a reason, because it's an absolutely unbelievable conversation. Today we have Richard Spence, or Rick as he likes to be called. Now, Rick is a full-time professor in history, and he specialises in Russian intelligence and military history. He has courses in modern espionage, anti-Semitism, and of course, the Holocaust. This conversation goes so much further than just the history aspect to his background. We talk about cults, we talk about secret societies, we talk about whether the Illuminati is real, or what really happened to Jeffrey Epstein. And on that note, you've probably had enough of me waffling on, so let's get into this episode of the Into the Mind podcast. I was quite interested in the secret societies kind of thing. I suppose, to start with, how many secret societies actually are there in the world? Like, can you put a figure on that?
No. I mean, there are many, many, many. Some being more secret than others, and because some are more secret than others, you wouldn't necessarily know.
Yeah.
It's I mean, there's a whole wide gradation of that type of thing. Let's say you can take something like, well, you always have to start with this. You can take something like Freemasonry. Freemasonry is not secret. They advertise their existence. It's, as they like to describe it, it's not a secret society. It's a society with secrets, which is one way of looking at it. So there are those that advertise their existence, or at least do nothing to hide it. And there are other groups who, for one reason or another, sometimes because what they're doing is illegal, do keep it secret in
Mostly.
that way. And they're constantly metastasizing. That is, the tendency among groups is for them to split apart. And this is something you can look at. You can find the same sort of thing in religions, for instance. You can start with one thing, and then there will be some dispute. Somebody will have an argument. Usually it's an argument over who's going to be in control. And someone will split off a group, and then someone will split off from that, and someone will split off from that. And then sometimes these groups will recombine. So there's this constant division and recombination which is going on. It's a constantly changing landscape. So the closest I could probably come to, if you were going to do in the whole world, how many things that could be defined as secret societies are out there? Thousands, potentially tens of thousands of organizations of all sorts of sizes, things that exist in only one town, things that exist universally. So there's no real number you can put on it.
And what kind of influence do those societies have over us today? Like, there's obviously the big ones that people talk about, like the Illuminati and all that kind of stuff. But what influence do secret societies that we don't necessarily know about have over us today?
Well, that again is a big question, because the influence is one of those things that wouldn't necessarily be obvious in some cases. But here again is an example, and I'll go back again to, I'm not picking on the Freemasons, but they're numerous, they're well known, they're out there. So let's take an example of a charge or an accusation which is often made against Freemasonry, and probably more in the UK than in other countries. That's kind of ground zero for the whole thing. But one of the arguments was often brought up was that there was a very high concentration, at least if you go back to the early 20th century, of Masonic affiliation in law enforcement and in the judiciary. You also tended to find a lot of lawyers who were involved. So you had solicitors and barristers, you had judges, you had policemen, everything from constable up to the chief of Scotland Yard. So one of the arguments was that with so many people in these particular areas that were affiliated with the same group and had made certain pledges of loyalty to members within that group, did that compromise their ability to do their job? So that is, if the judge trying the case was the member of the same fraternity as let's say the judge presiding over the case, that of both of the attorneys who were involved, and maybe even the police officials who are giving evidence, and you as the defendant are not, would you feel that you were possibly disadvantaged in that situation? Now, the assumption there is that these people, being members of the same group, in which they do indeed make grisly oaths of loyalty to the group and to each other, they are bound to each other in that way. Would that compromise their objectivity? If someone was left out of that situation, the same sort of thing, you find yourself in a business arrangement and you find out that you're the only person in this business deal who isn't a Freemason or isn't a member of the Great Order of Buffaloes or whatever it might be. Does that, might you reasonably feel that if things didn't work out well, that you were disadvantaged because these people all had some bond that you didn't have, that they would make allowances for each other, that they would give favors to each other? So, in fact, one of the ways that secret societies as a whole have been described, and I think it's a little bit too broad, is that they're a kind of favor bank. It's a way of gaining a certain degree of social advantage by being members of this specific group. Now, on the other side of it, particularly in Freemason, it will be sworn that our loyalties to each other and to the group will do nothing to compromise the discharge of public duties. Okay, we just don't do that, because that's another thing entirely. So if I am a police official, I would not let my membership in the order affect the performance of my duty. Which I think, it could be a very honest statement. It could also be an utterly dishonest statement, because if it wasn't, you're not going to say that. I mean, what else are you going to say under those circumstances? So there would always be that element of suspicion or mistrust. And that's what the greater herd of people dislike about these groups, or mistrust about them. And I mean, here's another example. Fraternities and sororities at universities, which again are secret societies. And it's maybe I should pause here for a moment and sort of define what I mean by a secret society. And I don't mean something that no one knows about, because everybody on campus knows that fraternities and sororities are there. They've got their Greek letters outside their houses. They advertise their existence. They're very public institutions. So what's often disliked about them is the idea is that they're cliquish, that they have a particular loyalty to each other, and that they often in some way behave as perceived by others as if they are superior to the kind of common herd of students as they go through. But this is how you would define it. And this fits a sorority, fraternity. It would fit Freemasonry. It fits the Great Order of Buffaloes, whatever you'd want to have. The most important thing is that they're self-selecting. They're not open to everyone. There's nothing which is public or democratic about their recruitment. They pick people for particular reasons. And usually the reasons why someone would be admitted to it is because they're seen from the beginning as being someone who is simpatico to the group as a whole, somebody who will fit in. So if you're thinking, fraternities and sororities have things, at least in American universities, called a rush at the beginning. It's a recruitment drive. And people who are interested in sometimes people will go and they'll shop around to different fraternities. And you either get picked or you don't. And the reason that you get picked is there's a reason for it. And usually the reason you would get picked is you're seen as someone, they kind of liked you. You made a good impression on them. There's nothing that weird about that. You made a good impression, so you get picked to be part of the group. You get chosen to be part of the team, whereas other people do not. But keep in mind that itself is secret. You'll never really know. No one's going to sit down with you and explain why you didn't get in. You just didn't make the right impression, and you don't even know exactly what sort of characteristics they might be looking for. So they choose who is admitted. And they generally do that on some sort of criteria. There's something they're looking for in prospective members, which is never entirely upfront, but which is always a matter of choice. Now, once you're chosen to be part of the group, you have to be sworn in. You have to go through a process of initiation. And initiations are really a series of oaths and rituals. So again, if you were to look at Freemasonry at all three steps in sort of standard Blue Lodge Freemasonry, you go through an initiation. And these are, in many ways, if you looked at it from the outside, they would appear to be just sort of silly. And the most important thing about that is that you do it, you go through with it. I mean, the willingness often to do absurd or silly things is part of your admission to the group. You have to be willing to participate in that. If you balked, then you wouldn't be a portion of it. So, and this is why one of the things that's often a matter criticized in the case of college fraternities is that they engage in hazing. The initiations can be rough. All right, they may involve, you know, you might get hurt. And in fact, that may be part of the whole purpose. Not, every now and then someone gets killed. That's not the purpose of it, but there can be a certain amount of danger or embarrassment, some sort of physical stress. But keep in mind what those things are about. In any case, is they're testing the new member. Uh, can they put up? Do they have a sense of humor in a very broad sense? Are they willing to humiliate themselves publicly in order to gain the acceptance of the group? And you need to be able to do that. I mean, you can take this down to another level in terms of what we would call criminal gangs, which are secret societies. Remember, you get picked. And one of the things that in a gang, which is often an important part of initiation, is taking a beating. Now, you get jumped in, which means that everybody just piles on and they, beat the crap out of you. And the whole thing is to see whether or not you can do that, because it's important to know whether in some other situation you're good in a fight. Can you take a punch? So seeing how this person behaves in a fight would be a poor. So there can be all these sort of tests which are given. So, for instance, in going back again as an example of Freemasonry, there are these grisly oaths that and the whole thing is that you will never, ever, ever reveal what goes on in the lodge. That's the secret part. You don't talk about what we do. What we do in the shadows. Okay, what we do, you don't talk about. And if you do, you've sworn that, you'll have your heart cut out, you'll be left at low tide to be eaten by crabs, all of this kind of stuff. So that sometimes is turned out. See, this is how murderous these groups are, because they've, you've just been threatened with death if you reveal the secrets. You know, Maybe in some case it depends upon how seriously people want to take things, but I don't think in most cases that's really what it's about. And in fact, I once sort of challenged a fellow I knew, who I knew was a very loyal Freemason, and I was sort of like, look, these oaths of all the awful things that will happen to people. I mean, this is never really going to happen, right? I mean, this is all just sort of pretend. It's make believe. And he goes, yeah. And he goes, but that's not what the purpose of these oaths actually are. The purpose of the oaths is to make it clear that this is serious, that this is not something you should take frivolously. You are really pledging your personal honor and loyalty to this. And if you betray the oath, if you go and talk about if you betray the order, what you have demonstrated, your punishment in a sense, is that you have demonstrated yourself to be a dishonest and faithless individual. Because that's the test that it has. If you break your oath, well, then we all found out what kind of a person that you are. And that would be, you'll then be expelled, and everybody else in society will know that you're not to be trusted with any kind of secret in that sense. But it's always that question of how seriously you want to take it. And I think that can vary between individuals and circumstances. I mean, how far do you want? It's like, how rigorous do you want to make the initiation? How dangerous do you want to have that to be? So, is that going to involve a certain amount of drinking? Probably. That's supposedly in fraternities they want to know if you can hold your liquor. So let's see how drunk you can get. And in some cases, that's taken pretty far. And then you have people dying of alcohol poisoning because they just consumed too much in an effort to prove that they could hold their liquor in some cases. So there's a lot of variation between everyone is a little bit different. Every lodge is a little bit different because every lodge is composed of different people who've been chosen by the people who are there. And it all sort of depends who's there. See if that makes any kind of sense. Like tends to attract like.
Yeah.
And generally one of the things, if you have any kind of, whether it's a fraternity, whether it's a Masonic lodge, whatever sort of group, whatever sort of club that you're forming, you're going to want people there who are going to get along with everyone else. Now, a lot of people say, oh, well, we really value diversity of opinion and we want to have people there who have lots of other ideas. And some cases, and that's true, but in most cases, it's not. Because what you're going to get if you have a room full of people who have widely divergent political and religious opinions, is you're going to get arguments. Now, that's kind of interesting because the two things traditionally that are never supposed to be discussed in a Masonic lodge, that are never supposed to come up, at least within the context of actual lodge activities. You're not supposed to talk about politics, and you're not supposed to talk about religion. Why? Because those will cause arguments. Now, the minute that the meeting is over, then you can go down to the bar and, you're also not supposed to drink in the lodge meeting because you don't want people who are getting drunk and then talk. It's not arguments. So everybody stays sober and you avoid those topics. But then when you're done with that business, you can go down to the pub and then everybody can get into these kind of arguments. But remember, it's the same group of people in those two different circumstances. It all sort of depends where you are. So the idea is you want to get people who, for the most part, will get along with each other, who are like you in some way. That's who we want to hang out with for the most part. So not that one person is a clone of someone else, but you've got people who are to a certain extent like-minded. So what you will tend to find is that in any group over time, as they selectively recruit members, they will recruit people who are like-minded so that the group will tend to think alike and act alike on important questions.
Yeah. And I think people need they want to have a clan, right? They want to surround themselves with their friend group. Do you think that because of the inference of social media and there's this kind of loneliness epidemic, do you think that's actually paying dividends for these secret societies in terms of recruitment? Because surely more people will want to go into them in order to have that clan and have that friendship group around them.
I think it has to some degree. I mean, at least in the American context, memberships in what were called fraternal organizations, of which Freemasonry was the largest, but then you had Odd Fellows, and you've got all the animal totems, the eagles, the moose, all these different groups. That all peaked pretty much in the post-World War II era. And then, beginning in the 1960s, that began to decline. And it's fairly steadily declined. So there's I'm not sure I could give you. I mean, at one point there was something like 4 million Freemasons in the United States in a much, in a much smaller population. And I think probably that's down to around 1 million today. So it certainly is smaller than it was. But I have been recently told that there has been kind of an uptick in membership. And one of the things that I've noticed, even locally, so keep in mind, I live in the western U.S., in Idaho, in a fairly rural area in a town of about 25,000 people, which is also a college town. So not a huge metropolitan area. And yes, we have our Masonic Lodge. It's right here. Um, one of the things I've noticed is that they've been advertising. So all over campus a few weeks ago, there were all of these different signs, sort of advertising. Like if you ever, you ever wondered what goes on in a Masonic lodge, and they will actually sort of invite people to come. They sort of like they have these open house days where you can come in, but they're kind of, I guess that's their form of a fraternity rush, is to see what people show up and whether they seem to be interested. And someone else had told me, who actually is a member of a lodge in New York City, who said that they said their lodge has sort of grown, not dramatically, but that they've had membership having been static for years, that there has been that kind of increase.
Have you ever wanted a luxury watch, or maybe something special like a diamond for the other half? Well, I have the place for you to go. Chisholm Hunter are the sponsors of the Nth Mind podcast, and Chisholm Hunter has been going for over 165 years. Yes, you heard me, 165 years. They're family run. They have about 28 stores throughout the UK, and they are the best place to get your luxury watch or your luxury diamonds. Now, they're actually world renowned for their luxury diamonds, but being a male, typically, I like my luxury watches. I actually collect luxury watches, and all the watches I get from Chisholm Hunter. And one of the reasons is that they're actually an authorized retailer. They're authorized for brands like Blancpain, Breguet, Tag Heuer, Vacheron Constantin, Tudor, and pretty much every brand you can think of. They are authorized retailers, which makes them trustworthy. And when you've got over 165 years of experience, it's not been built for no reason. It's been built on trust. And they are the only jewelers, the only official authorized jewelers that I actually trust. So if you're looking for something for yourself or a loved one, head to chisholmhunter.co.uk. That is chisholmhunter.co.uk. And while you're there, type in the discount code CHSUB, that is CHSUB, for an exclusive 10% off selected lines. This is my way of saying thank you for supporting the podcast. So that's chisholmhunter.co.uk, chisholmhunter.co.uk. And let's get back to this conversation with Rick.
What all these things are, well, at least things, I mean, secret societies for the most part, is that notice the way in which members refer to each other in the great majority of cases. So here is my lodge, what? Brother. Here is my sorority, sister. Here's my fraternity. Fraternity is a collection of brothers. That's all that it means. So they're always referring to each other as brothers. They're not, but they're. So what you're creating, literally, is an artificial family. But the difference is that in the case of the lodge, fraternity, whatever it might be, this is a family crafted, a family in which the members have been vetted to be, to a certain degree, like-minded, not like your real family. So, and that's the real families are, we all have them, and they can be wonderful. Everybody can get along, or they can be hellscapes. I mean, family is just one of those things you cannot control. And this is why, holidays, everybody getting together, there are people who look forward to those, and there are people who dread them because they're going to have to go back and be with their family. So that's and I think probably in all fairness, in most families, there's some little part of it that we do dread. There's someone. If it's not a brother and a sister you don't get along with, it's that cousin. Or, worst of all, I would argue, in-laws.
Oh, terrible,
All right,
terrible.
they can be great. They can be great, or they can be really weird. One of the two, and you have no control. But at least you're not related to them. Is the whole idea that you would have.
Yeah.
So yeah. So the lodge is a much more comfortable situation. Everybody there's just vetted to a degree, and if they misbehave, if they violate their oath, or they do something wrong, you can kick them out. You can't kick people out of the family. They're always there.
Yeah.
They'll keep coming back.
At what point does that get dangerous? Because, like, from all, when you look at this from a wide angle view, potentially it's actually a positive thing getting people together. But I suppose the initiations obviously don't sound exactly healthy, especially when you have the college students that are all getting absolutely hammered. But at what point does it become an actual danger to society? Like, you look at Charles Manson and what he did. He made a cult around him that would do anything for him.
Well, it's always that slippery slope. It's the question comes down. You get this whole group together. What do you do? And it's a so here again. Go back to Freemason. You ask me, okay, well, what are you in this thing for? I mean, what? Okay, to have a group of guys to hang out with? Is that what you want to do? I mean, can't you play fantasy football or something and find the same sort of thing, which doesn't involve the horrific oaths? So you generally get the idea. Well, joining the lodge is all about. It's sometimes used that what Freemasonry about is taking good men and turning them into better men. It's a process of self improvement. Remember, you are supposed to learn something through this whole sort of process. It's not just getting together and getting drunk, because that's not what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to learn, you're supposed to develop, you're supposed to in some way, even arguably spiritually develop, to become a better person, to become more introspective, that there are lessons that you learn, well, here's one, the most interesting description of Freemasonry, and the one that I think probably cuts closest to what's actually supposed to be going on, doesn't mean it really is that it's a system of morality veiled in allegory and illustrated by symbols. System of morality veiled in allegory, illustrated by symbols. Well, that sounds very simple. So I challenge you, what the hell is that? I mean, I've just given you a description that doesn't actually describe anything, because you don't know what the morality is, nor the allegories, nor the symbols. But you notice that if Freemasonry, most of these groups always have a very important in terms of symbolism. All of those things mean something. The initiation rituals you go through mean something. And one of the things that's a common theme there is the whole idea of death and resurrection. It's a kind of weird baptism in some way. You have to go through this whole process of illumination, and that's what that's what the Illuminati are all about, right? Illumination, to become enlightened as to a greater reality or some sort of greater moral force in some way. So you are meant to learn something and get something out of it. Now, that all sounds good, and it sounds harmless, and for the most part it can be. But again, it comes down to a matter of intention. It's always a matter of intent. And if you think about it, that's always the whole great issue in human relations, isn't it? I mean, you meet someone in any, co-workers, whatever it is, you're out at a bar, you're talking to people, you're trying to chat up some girl, but it's always a matter of intention. What does she want? What does he want? What do they actually want? Because one of the things that you learn pretty early on is that people can come off as very friendly, but their intention is not friendly. And you can also run across people who seem to be gruff or distant or hostile, but you actually find out that their intention is that they're not hostile. They're sort of guarded, probably because they've been burned before in dealing with people. But it's And it's even one of the things that you can kind of develop a certain sense for. There's a certain level of friendliness, but then there's also the sort of uncanny valley part you get into where people that you've just met seem to be overly friendly. Again, what's their intent? So figuring out what the intentions of our fellow creatures are is something that we spend our whole life doing. So the intention of organizing a group, selectively recruiting, swearing people to secrecy and loyalty. So why would you want to swear someone to secrecy? Well, one, you want to keep privacy. Everyone wants to have things to be private. But an equally valid reason for swearing someone for secrecy is you're going to do something which is illegal or immoral. You're going to do something that if everybody else found out you were doing it, they wouldn't like it. So, and this is why you have criminal secret societies. Okay? Criminal secret societies operate exactly the same way. They selectively recruit. They demand loyalty and obedience. They have a process of initiation. And then they go out and commit criminal acts, whereas other groups do not. It all depends on what the purpose of the group is and the intention which is behind it. Now, the other advantage in this, the other advantage to forming these small groups, is that they're much easier to control. Because, again, something that I think we've all observed in one form or another is that the more people you involve in anything, the less gets done. I'm sure you've worked with committees in one form or another at work.
Yeah, it's
The
terrible.
most useless form of human activity. Someone once told, I always like this idea, is that every person added to a committee decreases its collective intelligence by 5%. Okay. So in other words, the larger the committee gets, the more incapable it becomes of doing anything. That is almost so you got to get committees to a manageable size. A committee of 5 people will work. A committee of 20 people, it's not going to happen. So notice right there's the idea of exclusiveness. See the advantage of getting together a group of like-minded people who already sort of fundamentally agree on something, and then organizing them for a specific purpose. All of that becomes so much easier if you're already halfway there through your selective recruitment to begin with. Now, the purpose that you're organizing them for, it can be self-improvement. They can become being better men or better women through participation in the group. Or your purpose can be overthrowing the government. Because behind virtually every revolution in one form or another is a kind of actual or de facto secret society. And the way that I've put it is that you can't have a revolution without a conspiracy. It doesn't work any other way. You don't go out and just publicly overthrow the government because you'll be hanging before noon. They won't like that, and they'll kill you. So you have to do things secretly. Let's organize the whole thing as a book club. There we go. It's a book club. And we'll all come and we'll sort of pick people to be part of the book club. And what are we going to study in the book club? I don't know. Maybe Das Kapital by Karl Marx. Okay. We'll all study Marxist literature. And it's just a book club, see? It's not a political organization at all. Well, the other purpose of that is that you're all looking for people who are particularly interested and committed in some way. I mean, maybe what you're actually ultimately looking to do is to recruit people to be terrorists. But you have to start out with a larger group and become more selective in that case. So it's very easy. Well, here again, one of the things you'll often get people in Freemasonry who will vociferously deny is that because there's not supposed to be politics involved, that therefore there's no involvement of Freemasonry in political actions or revolution, and nothing could be further from the truth. Okay. Whether you look at the American Revolution or the French Revolution or the Young Turk Revolution or virtually any of them, you will tend to find not the lodges themselves involved. That is, you don't have Freemasonry as an organization involving it, but you have people who who are affiliated in this group who then go on and do something else. I mean, think of it this way. Once you have created this cohesive group of like-minded people who share certain views, one of which could be self-improvement, the other could be is that we must overthrow the existing political order, you can then set them to other purposes. So something which is formed for one purpose may serve others as well. And the other thing is you've got the perfect petri dish for political conspiracy. You've selected people, you can kind of trust them, you've sworn them to loyalty, and we never talk about what goes on. So yeah. So the next step, yeah, is
At
plotting.
what point does that become a cult? Like, because obviously you've got your kind of your small societies or smaller societies. At what point does that become a cult that somebody could literally say, "Go and try and assassinate Donald Trump," and the person goes, "Yeah, I'll do it."
Be careful
Done.
what you. Okay. We're talking hypothetically. Okay, this is not.
Of course.
Yes, all hypothetically. Hypothetically, what did this happen? Well, that gets into the other interesting idea. What's a cult? What's the difference between a cult and a religion and a secret society? All these different. We love to name things. That's what humans like to do. We like to give a name to something because once we've named it, we think we know what it is. We can categorize it in some way. So, the description I gave of a secret society is that it has selective recruitment, oaths of initiation, you owe a particular loyalty to that. A cult, one of the main features in a cult, which you wouldn't necessarily have in your average secret society, is that you have a central figure. You have some kind of almost messianic leader to whom members show what's called excess devotion. So it's not unusual to have somebody who's the head of the group, who's the head of the club, elected, president of the fraternity. But there's a difference between doing that and worshiping them as a god and doing everything they tell you to. So one of the key things, if you're thinking, is this a cult? You would look at it and see whether or not there is some central leader to which everyone gives unquestioning obedience, and to which, to some degree, they treat as a kind of god or godlike figure. Now that again, this is where you would bring in someone like Charlie Manson. Completely, they psychologically dominate their followers. And in an average, more run-of-the-mill fraternal order, you wouldn't find that. Leaders would come and go, and it's much more about the group collectively than it's about anyone. But in a cult, it's always about one person who controls everything that goes on. And then you've got the ability of that person to direct people. It's a process that, some people, you might eventually gotten around to this, ask me why I'm interested in these types of things or how many of these groups I belong to. The answer is I don't belong to any of them. And I don't belong to any of them because I don't want to. It doesn't attract me. Because, from my standpoint, is that the minute you get inside of them, you have to obey a lot of rules. Okay? That's it. Once you get in there are things you can do and you can't do. And I just don't like people telling me what to do. I couldn't even hack the Boy Scouts. Let's put it that way. The Boy Scouts was too onerous for me because there's always someone telling me this is what it is you have to do. So my fascination with this is from looking from the outside because, and this is why I want to understand it, because at some basic level, I just don't get it. I don't really, and mostly when it comes down to something like belonging to some sort of group, where you've got a guru or whatever you want to call them, and you hang on their every word and do what they tell you. So years ago, I did know someone reasonably well. They weren't a close friend, but they joined a cult. That's what it was. And There was a guy who was at the center of it, and they hung on his every word, and they also did things like sell all of their belongings and give him the money.
What?
Things he did with it was to go out and buy a yacht. So he
Oh
he
my
lived on a
God.
yacht, and the rest of them were, and there were the whole group had these various businesses that were run, and there was like a Whole Foods market and a restaurant. You know, the guy was running a business empire, and he was getting people to work for him for nothing because of the idea this was part of their religious duty. So, from my standpoint, perhaps unfairly or not, it just looked like they were being scammed. Okay, this guy's just
Yeah,
taking
that's pretty
advantage
fair.
of you. You're going to sell your car and all of it, and you're going to give him the money, and he's going to live on the yacht, and you're going to work for him for nothing. And this is all because he's giving you, supposedly spiritual enlightenment and putting you in contact with the Lemurians, which was, yeah, that was one of his things as well. It was, to me, it was the most incomprehensible, unbelievable collection of codswallop I'd ever heard. But I knew that the person I was talking to was, they're not stupid. That wasn't the
Mhm.
problem. And this is one of the things you find if you tend to look at a lot of cults, is that they're nominally full of people who are often well educated, which is an insurance against nothing, by the way. Okay. So they were well educated, and they weren't they didn't lack for mental capacity. They were all reasonably intelligent or even slightly above average in that, but they were completely taken in by this. And at one point, this person was describing to me the things they were doing and the process they had to go through. And the only thing I could think of to say is, what the hell is the matter with you? I mean, what what's wrong with you? Have you lost your mind? That was, I mean, have you just gone nuts? Why else would you do it? They didn't take that well. They thought I would, but that was just where the two sort of perceptions. I could no longer come up with any rational explanation for what it was they were doing, other than that they had just gone in some way insane. And to them, on the other hand, this was the path of this was the true path of spiritual enlightenment. This was what it was, by giving their money and getting rid all of this away, he was helping them because he was helping them free themselves from the tyranny of physical possessions. Of course, they give all your stuff to me, money is corrupting. Possessions are corrupting. So give it to me and I will selflessly take it on. And you will get this. I guess it worked for them in some way. But no, it was just, I did not get it, and I still don't get it.
Sounds like a great idea. I should start doing that.
Oh, cults, the tremendous growth. That's why they constantly crop up, because you can always get people to fall for it, and it doesn't even have to be a particularly good story. I mean, it doesn't. It's And that was one of my, not going into great detail. One of my particular problems with this group is that his whole sort of mythology around it, it didn't even strike me as being that original. It was like something that came out of some 1940s science fiction pulp magazine. So I mean, can't you come up with a better story? That's the question I often have.
How do you think that happens? Like, I know you won't know in detail how these people operate and what they actually do, but like, just sort of taking a guess, how would a guy like Manson or this gentleman that you used to know, how would the leader of that group manipulate someone to the degree that they're essentially giving them all their money, and then even when it's right in front of their face, when the guy's buying a yacht with the money, they still can't get it? How can your mind be that warped? I just don't. It doesn't make sense to me.
Well, that's good that it doesn't make sense, I would argue. Um, Part of it, I think, it goes to the leader themselves. The leaders have to be very convincing. That's the essential point, is that the followers believe in this person implicitly. So what are the qualities? What is it that the leader does? What is it that they project that allows them to sell this story, which again is often not a particularly good story, wouldn't hold water as fiction, but they can get other people to follow it as some sort of life choice or spiritual path which they're on. In some cases, they're really good actors as a portion of it. But then what's a key to being a good actor, supposedly? Don't ask me personally, but among actors I've known, well, you have to believe in what you're doing. You have to get into the part. You have to believe you're that character. You have to immerse them. So you have to become another person to a degree. And I think that is the key in a cult leader, is that they believe in themselves. And there are two things going on there, I think. On the one hand, they know on some level that this is a scam, or they know that they're making this up. I'm convinced in most cases at some level. But what they've done is they've managed to cross this kind of psychological threshold in which they believe their own BS. Because they have to believe it to sell it to someone else. And this is one of the things that, we're often tremendously impressed by sincerity in people. Now, it goes back to what's the intent? How do you judge whether someone is trying to con you? Well, we sort of measure as to how sincere they seem to be. And very often we're very impressed by that. Someone seems to be tremendously sincere, and then you begin to take them serious. But it all comes down not really to a faith in what this person is telling you, but the faith in the person themselves. That's what you believe in. You believe in this individual sincerity because they have sold you on themselves. They literally cast a kind of spell. They create this whole idea, which then eventually brings you into this kind of psychological bondage, which you volunteer for. So one of the things, they never force you to do anything. You willingly, you give them your money and you're happy to do it. And you think that this is actually freeing you from something. So in that sense, it's not unfair to say that it's not that people don't get anything out of that. The person I knew really felt much better for having done these things. I mean, even though it seemed to me they looked like that they were being manipulated and they were being foolish, to them, they were really, they were gaining out of that situation. So it's the ability of a Manson, for instance, or any of the other leaders you can have, in order to convince themselves of what they're saying, and that then it gives you the ability to convince other people, not everyone, but the people who are particularly susceptible to what it is that you're saying. That's often the case. Again, they're looking for some sort of community. They're looking to be part of something larger than themselves. They're lonely, they're confused, and one of the things that the doctrine of the cult gives you is an explanation for everything. It's all there. All you have to do is follow these things and do what I tell you, and happiness and joy will be yours.
Do you think it comes down to blackmail in any way? I'm just thinking about what you said there in terms of actors and in terms of people having to believe their own BS in order to convince other people of it. And I'm thinking of someone like Jeffrey Epstein, who cultivated this line of high net worth individuals, high celebrities, and then he caught them all doing something on camera that they shouldn't have been doing, and then they used that as blackmail. Do you think like the introduction to the cult is one part, but then all of a sudden the cult leader has your vulnerabilities over you because you've done something that you shouldn't have?
Well, in the case of Epstein, I think Epstein is a slightly different animal in some way, because Epstein, as opposed to putting himself forward as a kind of messianic leader, to me, seems to be someone who more sort of stayed, he's a facilitator. So the key element in Epstein, looking at it, is that he ingratiated himself to wealthy, powerful people. He doesn't come from that background. Epstein comes from is a nobody, really. Comes from so many cases, from a kind of perfectly average family, and even early on, a more or less average kid. I mean, there's nothing particularly special about him. He wasn't, he did well academically, and most people who knew him sort of liked him. He was fairly likable. He was unobtrusive in some way. And that can be another form of manipulation. But you can do that. You can put yourself at center stage. You can make yourself the star of your own reality, and everything centers around you. Or you can kind of stand off to the side and facilitate people doing things. So Epstein basically became a pimp to the high and mighty. That's what his job was. He was a procurer. He allowed them to engage in vices, in certain, go. Look, I've got a private island, and I've got a jet, and we can all go to my private island, and what type of things you're interested in, what do you like, and I can provide, and he would provide that for people, and I think a clue to this is that the way that Epstein really sort of got started in business is that, and the way that he would attract clients is that he was all about tax shelters. He came up with strategies for tax dodging. That's what it was. So you got a lot of money and you want to keep your money and not give it to the government. Well, here's various ways, more or less legal, that you can do that. Now, once he showed some millionaire the way that they could keep more of their money, he had gained their trust to a certain degree. But that's sort of facilitating that. You're already taking people who are rich and powerful, and then you're doing things for them. You're really in a kind of servitor role. But you also have to watch this phenomenon of the servants who become the masters, who eventually control. And history is full of that, okay, of the people. You can find that if you look at how many monarchs are completely bamboozled and manipulated by their servants, by the people who essentially manage their lives, who are constantly telling them what they can do and what they can't do. And they realize that at some point they have virtually no control over their lives. They're simply their lives are run by their servants, who are actually therefore running the whole kind of system. So one can do that. So yeah, Epstein to me is the example of the servant who becomes the master. But now you've got people in these vulnerable situations, and then what does he do? He films them. He puts cameras everywhere. Now, that's a canny business strategy. You've now got the ability to compromise them. Yet it's not clear that he ever did that in many cases. I don't suppose they'd go out and publicly complain about it, but the possibility was there. To me, the more likely possibility is that I don't think Epstein was doing that for his own amusement. So the argument that he was filming his clients as a form of self-protection, well, that didn't work. But that he was getting video evidence of people for someone else makes more sense. But imagine what he has to sell. So I have all of these clients, I have these people, wealthiest, influential people in the world, coming to my private island, engaging in some cases, quite illegal sexual activities or whatever else you may want to find. And I have all of this on film. Who might want to acquire that? It's an interesting thing that one could sell. So I don't think he was doing it for his own amusement. I don't think that he was making all of these tapes just so he could have them on file somewhere. He was either creating them specifically to sell them, or he was being commissioned to create them by someone else.
So do you think that he could have been working for somebody and he was commissioned to start creating them? Or like, in my eyes, it seems like a get out of jail free card. In my eyes, it seems like if you don't get me out of jail, I'm going to release this video. And he had wealthiest, most powerful people there. We had Prince Andrew there, who was doing allegedly pretty
Allegedly.
horrendous, allegedly pretty horrendous things. I just don't. Do you think it's possible that he was working for a central intelligence agency?
He could have been, yes. I think it's possible. I don't think that that's a fact because there's not, right? You have relatively, you have to go back to facts are the things that you really know. So one of the things that we really know is that Jeffrey Epstein died apparently through self-strangulation while in custody. Okay, those are the basic facts. Now, what does that explain? Okay, the big question here, which doesn't answer, was that I don't know. Did he just get all depressed in his cell? And did he kill himself or did someone kill him? Because either one of those are fit the circumstances. I'd say that actually the idea that someone killed him probably fits the circumstances all the better because I don't know that he would necessarily, if he thought this was a get out of jail free card, why would he kill himself? But it didn't work. It certainly was not the get out of jail free card. It was that, oh, suddenly the surveillance cameras are just going to go off for no particular reason. There's a peculiar set of circumstances that would acquire this. So, again, you can't say what happened and what didn't happen because you don't know. But I'd say he died under highly suspicious circumstances. And considering who he was and what he was involved in, that makes it even more suspicious. So if this was his great get out of jail free card, it didn't work. It backfired on him. I think it could be, again, the information that he had acquired, the compromising material that he had on powerful people, certainly had a great deal of value. And I think it probably had greater value for others who might have wanted to manipulate those individuals than it did for him. So he facilitated people doing nasty things. And at the same time, he realized that this was something that he could exploit and potentially profit from. Because his whole life had been figuring out how to profit from his association with wealthy people. That's how he got to remember, he didn't start out rich. He got rich by his association with these people, and he associated with them because he facilitated them either dodging taxes or sleeping with 14-year-old girls. Whatever, it's kind of from one to the other in that case. So there's a lot of there's a historical case which is vaguely similar to this in some respects. Not exactly. But if you go back to late Weimar Germany, everybody's favorite beer. If you go back to Berlin in the early 1930s, with Weimar Republic collapsing, the Nazis on the rise, you had a peculiar public figure in Berlin, a popular entertainer by the name of Erich Jan Hanussen. He was a stage psychic. He was a mind reader. That's how he started. He did mind reading routines. And then he branched into astrology. And he became a big deal. He was the biggest draw probably in Berlin theaters in 31 and 32. And he published his own sort of, I think, weekly magazine about his horoscope predictions and the rest of it. And one of the things that he began doing is that he began predicting the electoral rise of the Nazis. And his predictions came true, which then attracted the interest of certain people in the Nazi hierarchy. For instance, the fellow who was the head of the brown shirt organization in Berlin, a guy named Count Helldorf, became quite friendly with him. And eventually, and he actually does in the summer of 1932, he actually meets Adolf Hitler on some occasions. I don't think it was necessarily the most important meeting that Hitler ever had, but he does actually encounter him, and he makes these whole kinds of predictions that, yes, you will eventually become chancellor, which Hitler did, so these guys are impressed. This guy seems to be predicting the future. Now, the thing about Hanussen is that he is, as I think he probably would, he's a stage, he's a complete charlatan. I mean, I don't know. Maybe he does have some psychic abilities. Who's to say that that's not the case? But for the most part, he's a fake. He's a very good fake, as people are. He had the whole sort of, again, starts out as a mind reader, goes through it. Now, the other interesting thing about Hannesen, particularly because of his association with high-ranking Nazis, including Hitler, is that he's Jewish. Right? He pretends not to be. His real name is Herschel Steinschneider. Okay, so but he sort of presents himself as Hannesen. He pretends to be an orphan Danish nobleman. You know, his Danish noble parents did something like go skiing in the Alps and died in a skiing accident, and then he was just taken in by this kindly Jewish family that raised him. Which explained why he could speak Yiddish and not a word of Danish. So that would, but it's just this story that he makes up. But his actual Jewish roots were available for anyone who looked. It was all in the records in Vienna, where he was from. Everything is there. His parents, his marriages, the whole thing. And it certainly was the case that many of his Nazi associates knew this. They wanted to cover it up, but because it was kind of embarrassing. But nevertheless, they were aware of it. But still, he was useful to them. He was ingratiating themselves with them. So one of the things that Hannesen did is that because he was kind of a big deal in this period, he had a fancy apartment in Berlin, a whole floor of a building basically, that he turned into a kind of private nightclub called the Palace of the Occult. And anybody who was anybody would come there, and he would give, everything from tarot card readings to, it was this whole big show that he would put on. And he also had a private yacht. I think it was called the Seven Sins. And on this yacht, he would throw parties. He also would have, poker games, which people would lose money to him, oddly enough, in certain cases. But on this yacht and in his Palace of the Occult, there were rooms for things that went on, and there were cameras filming everything. So there would be important people in German business and in politics, including high-ranking members of the Nazi and other parties, who would come to parties on Hannesen's yacht, probably engage in sexual activities of one form or another, and end up on film. And he had those. Just like Jeffrey Epstein, he had his collection of filmed evidence against wealthy people. Now, guess what happened to Hannesen eventually? He does, he predicts all of these things. He eventually, some months after the Nazis, well, it's not even months, it's actually just weeks after the Nazis come to power, his decomposing bullet-ridden body is found outside Berlin in the woods. So he again was gotten rid of by unknown people because he is useful to a point, and then he becomes inconvenient, which is something you never want to become. Never become a loose end. Those have a habit of being tied up. But it's not exactly the same story as Epstein, but you see, there's a common thread. That these type of people have always been around. That Hannesen in his day, in Weimar, Berlin, was sort of playing much the same kind of role in some sort of game. He was an apparent facilitator who was helping to, as opposed to being a leader of an organization. He was just facilitating people doing it in their vices and then profiting off of that.
How can people? What group is that high up that they can manipulate? Like, let's say that Jeffrey Epstein was murdered. What group would facilitate that? Because they need to be so powerful in order to cover that whole thing up. Like, I know that the one that everyone talks about is the Illuminati, and they always say, oh, it's the Illuminati. And part of me thinks that's them just creating something in people's minds to bring blame off of themselves. But is there a force above the government, do you think, that's extremely powerful and is controlling and pulling the government strings?
Well, that's a really interesting question, which I've asked myself on more than one occasion. So some years back, some friends, some other researchers and I were, a lot of my interest has to deal with things which involves espionage and, the Russian Revolution and events in that period of time. And we're looking at these whole assorted, what you're looking at are a series of interlocking conspiracies. I mean, people are plotting to achieve things. Nothing unusual in that. People do that all the time. But sometimes what gets really confusing is exactly, well, who's this benefiting? Who's actually getting something out of it? And so let's say you're looking at various sort of conspiratorial or underground currents taking place in Europe in the early 1920s. So remember this, you've got you've now got the rise of the Soviets, so you got the Bolsheviks running around everywhere. And in Italy, you've got the rise of fascism, and then of course you've got the British Empire, which is constantly trying to keep the British Empire going. And you got the French who are trying to keep the French Empire going. And so you get all of these different forces contending with each other. Never forget the Americans, because they're out there doing something. So the assumption is that everything sort of goes up to the state level. That's as high as it goes. So what you've got are governments that are contending with each other. So you have these different empires and different states. You got the Russians, the Brits, the French, the Americans, whoever else it might be, and they're all sort of contending for these situations. And that would seem to make sense, but we couldn't always find it didn't seem to occur that any particular government seemed to be benefiting off of this. And you could create a scenario. You can sort of put these pieces together in different ways. Again, it's come back, you have relatively few facts. So you could say that, let's say, the fact was that there was a particular assassination of a public official in the Balkans. I'm just kind of making this up, but a prime minister of Bulgaria is assassinated. Well, who does that benefit? What was the actual purpose for this? And we would keep coming across these situations where it appeared that no particular government really seemed to be running it, and it raised the question as to whether or not there was something above the state level, which we gave the fancy name to of Factor X. Okay, is there some sort of X factor at work in this? Is there something else? Is there some sort of organized force with some particular agenda of its own, which is not part of any particular government? And so that gets us into Illuminati territory, right? We never called it that. We never wanted to go that direction. And I think that kind of oversimplified it. But there was this sort of strange semi-mythical entity that we ran across, we thought might have something to do with this. And by semi-mythical, I mean it's an organization which is occasionally, only sort of rarely referred to, and it's often mentioned in works that are not wholly reliable. I mean, the whole point is, I don't even know whether this group actually exists. That's one of the first things. And there's a lot of things that you can find that way, that there's some evidence for its existence, but it's not entirely clear. So is it even there? So what I'm talking about was the thing that was probably best known, at least in the English-speaking world, to the extent it was known at all, as the International Secret Service Bureau, which ostensibly it was around before the First World War, and it operated out of Brussels. It was centered in Belgium. And why in Belgium? Well, one of the reasons apparently was because Belgium, because it was a neutral country, was also one of, if not the only country in the world where espionage was not illegal. Because, see, if you're a neutral country, then you can't make any complaints about people spying on you. So it was headquartered in Brussels. And what it was a private organization composed of former members of the intelligence services of the larger European countries. Russia, Britain, France, Germany, etc. These are all people who had sort of worked for those services and now had gone private. So what did they do? Well, ostensibly, what they did was that they performed services for a fee for governments that those governments did not want to be connected with, or in any way, they didn't want to get their hands dirty. They wanted something done. So let's say they wanted someone dead, but they didn't want in any way to have their hands connected to an assassination. So you hired this organization of private spies who continued to have links to all of the intelligence services that they had formerly worked for. I mean, this was the intriguing idea that this organization composed of intelligence service veterans, which then still had links to their former employers, in some way actually, as a single thing, infiltrated all of the intelligence services in Europe. That was where they could all sort of come together in some way. But that this organization performed these actions purely for profit. That's the only thing they were interested in. They had no moral agenda. They have no political agenda. They simply do what it is that they're paid to do. Now, the interesting thing about that is that while the actual proof of the existence of this organization is thin, and I mean paper thin, there is, I think, something to it. I think something of this organization existed, but then imagine the possibilities of that. Imagine that kind of organization operating across decades, performing actions for different customers, which are all secret, around the world, but then also at what point does it begin operating for itself? What if it develops some kind of agenda of its own? So there's a one of the stories about this relates to it's like 1919. It's the aftermath of the First World War, and Russia has collapsed, and the Bolsheviks have taken power over part of the country, but there's a great deal of chaos. And at this particular point in time, the French have occupied the Black Sea port of Odessa, which they actually do. This is the whole sort of intervention phase. So the French have occupied Odessa, supposedly to sort of keep it from falling into the hands of the Bolsheviks, but nobody was entirely sure. And the commander of the French forces in Odessa is approached one day by a woman, and she gives her name as Nata Azef. And she comes to see him, and she goes, well, I represent this organization, the International League of, she gives some different name for it, but the International Secret Service Bureau, this private organization. She goes, well, we were basically hired to bring about the Bolshevik Revolution, which we did. We helped facilitate that. And so, in a sense, we kind of control what's happening. And she goes, if your government will pay us the amount of money we request, we could reverse that process. Or, if you want to keep control of Odessa, you're going to have to pay us because we can manipulate the situation. So you should take that message back to Paris and make the arrangement for payments. And he doesn't really take her seriously. Toys with the idea of having her arrested, but never conveys the message to Paris. And what the supposed lesson for that is that shortly thereafter, the French are eventually forced to leave Odessa. They lose control of the situation. What she predicted would happen exactly happens in that case. Now, that's a story. So one of the questions for me is that I don't know whether the organization exists. Does this woman, Nata Azef, actually exist? And I didn't think she did, but it turns out there really was a woman by that name. And she sort of was in the right place at the right time. And that was, it's one of those the things, the kind of fascinating question about all of this stuff is you enter this idea of where you're not sure what's real and what's imaginary. And there's always this sort of point where those two things come together. And I think part of this is the whole sort of the pattern of secrecy. And it goes back to what we were talking about at the beginning, perhaps, is that if you wanted to have a kind of genuine secret society or semi-secret society, you might want to keep it in the situation where its existence is rumored, but is not confirmable. That is, where there's the idea that this thing exists, but no one can ever really put their finger on it exactly. So if I would just say that in terms of what factor X could be, if there is some sort of influence, some sort of secret or conspiratorial influence in world affairs that is above the state level, then something like a private organization or for-profit spies who have perhaps some agenda of their own is one possibility. It makes perfect sense in a way. I mean, at what point do people who serve bureaucratic institutions decide that I could really do better on my own? I have skills and I have information. So I can either do those as a government employee or I could do those as a private entrepreneur.
Yeah, I think when it comes to the manipulation as well, and them being in charge of companies that are humongous. I mean, actually, Joe Rogan's a perfect example. His interview with Donald Trump was the most viewed interview of the century. And YouTube censored that so that it didn't come up when you searched it and it didn't go into the trending. So they've obviously got an agenda there. But do you think that Google is being manipulated by someone above it that's saying, push that down?
Well, somebody makes that decision. It doesn't happen accidentally. It didn't just happen in some way. I mean, they can blame it on the algorithm, maybe, but that's not what an algorithm does.
It's
Yes.
just too much of a coincidence.
It's look, at some point there was a group of people, a small group, because the large in a room somewhere, who agreed that a certain thing should happen. Now, that's a very simple statement, but again,
Mm.
there was a small group of people somewhere in a room that agreed that a certain thing should happen. That is the major driving force in all of human history. It's never mass action. It's never what everybody does, because the point is everybody doesn't do anything. And it's not a very attractive way of thinking about it. For the most part, the mass herd of humanity is just that. It's a mass herd that is continually being manipulated and herded in one direction or another.
Hmm.
Cattle who are either being driven into a corral or off a cliff. But there's always someone who's doing that. The cattle are being driven in that particular reason by someone, by the drovers, whoever it might be. Maybe you want to, take the buffalo off so you can collect all of the meat at the bottom. But there's always a purpose in what's going on. So remember, the larger the mass of people you have, the more difficult they are to organize and manipulate. So what you have, what's always dominated human affairs, what dominates every government, are small groups of people working in common to achieve a particular end.
Yeah, you've kind of blown my mind away a little bit with that.
That's what's always going on. We're going to have something to happen. So how do we strategically make these things happen?
Do you think there's a reason behind, if there was a group like that, hypothetically speaking, if there was a group like that that sit above the government, or that their agenda is money, do you think that they could be of the opinion that the war going on in Ukraine and Russia is a good thing? Because there's been a string of events that have happened. For example, Joe Biden signing over all the missiles, that seems to just aggravate the situation.
Well, it comes down to the idea as whether or not war is a kind of form of business. Of course it is. Of course, it's a business. It's always been a business. People make tremendous amounts of money off of all of this stuff. I'm not saying that that necessarily explains everything, but look, bombs have to be made by someone and they get paid for them. So from their standpoint, if I'm a munitions manufacturer, war is good for business. Why would I, if there's no war anywhere, then nobody's buying my bombs, nobody's buying my missile systems, and these things are all, they get used up, so you have to buy more. It's not like you buy a bunch of anti-aircraft missiles and they just sit around. Well, if they do, then they wear out after a while. You have to buy more anyway. But they get blown up. You use them, then you have to buy more in that case. So a very simple type of thing is that war is tremendously profitable for a certain segment of the business political world. I mean, the other example of that, I think, would be, and I think the war in Ukraine is pretty much the same thing. We'll leave it at that. But if you look at the 20-year American involvement in Afghanistan, which in the end achieved what? Absolutely nothing. You ended with exactly the same situation that you started with. Okay? You overthrow the Taliban. Years later, the Taliban come back into power. Now, what's changed in the meantime? What's changed in the meantime is the cycling through somebody's hands of trillions of dollars, all of the money that was poured into that country, all of the money that was poured into the Afghan army that just collapsed, just disappeared, vanished into the air. The billions and billions and billions and billions and all of the weapons that were used. Let's not even talk about all the lives, Afghan and otherwise, that were sacrificed in that, because in the greater scheme, those don't really, matter on that level. I know they should, but they don't. And it was simply, to me, what that was simply a vast wealth redistribution program. And it's never true that money is just, poured down a hole. We talk about that. Let's go pile it up. And now the idea was that one description of Afghanistan is let's just go pile up billions of dollars and set them on fire. Because that's not what happened. The money is still there. It simply passes from one hand to another. So that would be the interesting question. For all of the billions and billions and billions, for all of those years that were cycled through which the war was a means of recycling all of this material, of all of that money, it started in one place. We generally know it started in the U.S. Treasury. Where did it end up? Because it's all still out there somewhere. All of that money is still around.
Do you think that should be public knowledge in terms of the American people knowing exactly where that government, the Treasury's money was spent within that time period?
Should it be public knowledge? Well, probably, if you could go through all of the accounting. Will it be public knowledge? Absolutely not. You'd never get any. I mean, it would probably be hard. We just say that, well, the money was paid to the manufacturers and to the various contractors. It all went somewhere. I don't think the question is whether the immediate hands it went into, but where is it now? Where's all of that money now? Where did it eventually end up in some way? But part of that is just, it's keeping the system alive. I don't know. One of the ways it was described to me is that you've got companies who are munitions and arms contractors, and governments need those. You need an arms industry. Because you've got a military that needs to be supplied with this stuff, and who knows, you might get involved in a war. You might actually need these things, and you want to keep developing new types of weapons. So if you didn't have a continuous flow of money through contracts to the arms industry, they would go out of business, or they would do much less than they are. So you've got to fuel that, and one of the ways you fuel it is using their products, which means that you've got to have something to use them in, and therefore some kind of low-level war that just goes on for years and years and years and never really achieves anything because that was never really its purpose. Its purpose was never, the whole purpose of the Afghan war, I'd argue, was never about Afghanistan at all. It was all about simply the use of that as a means for the flow, the wastage of material. You need to use this stuff up so that you can acquire more, but also this vast sort of transfer of wealth. And the same thing in Ukraine. Western countries ship arms as if more and more and more, most of which just gets destroyed. It's just, if you look over the Donbass, is like a junkyard of all of this material, all financed through taxpayer dollars in one form or another, or through the Federal Reserve, which is just now just burned out rusting hulks, which is what the destiny of all of these things are to begin with. That's all it will ever be. But it's yes, war is a business. It always has been a business.
Can you see the war in Ukraine escalating to the point of a nuclear holocaust?
Is that a possibility? Yes. Is it a likely possibility? I would hope not. I don't think anybody in their right mind would want to see that happen. On the other hand, as we said when we were talking about cults, there are people who can just do crazy things who think that it's entirely normal. You get into a lot of this, one of the things that's going on in the Ukrainian conflict, and you've seen this whole idea of brinksmanship. So it's like, it's always, well, you can push somebody, and you're always trying to see whether or not they're going to push back. So how much can you provoke someone? So you get up into somebody's face and you start poking at it. You start putting your fingers in their chest. You get closer to them. And that's all a kind of test to see how they're going to respond. So are they going to continue to back up? Are they going to blink? Or are they going to punch you in the nose at some point? So the idea of sort of gradually pushing someone is that you can push, each of these little gestures in and of themselves will hopefully intimidate your opponent into backing off. You'll gain a kind of psychological domination over them, and even a kind of physical domination. But that that calculation all changes when they get pissed off and they just knock your block off. And that's the risk that you run in these things. I think the other scary idea, and I've heard this before, is that there are those people out there who think things like nuclear war is, not really that bad. I don't know. They all plan to be in a bunker somewhere. It's here's something. Now this was years ago. This was in California. This was back in the late 1970s. So this was still Cold War type of thing. And it was actually a serious discussion that was held. It was a sort of private meeting, and this person was talking about how a limited nuclear war, limited, not necessarily a full blown one. I don't know how you manage that. Would be managed. It would actually be one of the best things that would happen, because the idea is they go, well, what are the nukes going to destroy? They're essentially going to destroy large inner city urban areas. And, we've already got this problem in the U.S. with sort of Rust Belt cities. Can you hold on just a second? I have to release a dog from captivity. Hold on.
So Rust Belts, we were on Rust Belts.
Well, they described a limited nuclear war as the best, cheapest, and most efficient urban renewal program you could come up with. Because you would just get rid of all of these now defunct, outdated inner cities, and you would be able to buy up all of this stuff, at bargain basement prices, because initially it would be all, it's only going to be radioactive for a while. Okay, so you hold on to all of this as an investment. And then later, when the radiation gets down to lower levels, you can build it all back, and it would be wonderful. And all would be these new future cities and everything else. Um, and even there'd be fewer people around, so that means that there would be greater demand for labor, and everybody would be making more live. Everybody would be living a far better life in this post-limited nuclear war scenario because there would just be more stuff for everybody, and you'd be living in these brand new shiny cities after the old rusty ones were cleared out. And they were absolutely serious. It wasn't a joke, as far as I could tell. They were playing it off pretty well, but it was you could see the kind of advantage in that. So I don't think there are a lot of people who believe that, but there are some. And it's in the same way that there's someone who will always argue that yes, actually something positive could come out of that situation.
When I was doing my research on you, I was reading that you did quite a lot of research into sort of crime and what's the word? Prolific is probably the word. Prolific criminals. Is that right?
Prolific criminals. Well, I don't know. Mostly what I've done research into are spies. Okay, that's one of the things, and then that sort of leads you to, I get these questions about how I got interested in all of this stuff, and well, I'd say probably the ground zero of it again is that my main interest was in modern Russian history, which then of course brings you to what? What's there? Russian Revolution. What have you got there? Well, you got a big you got you do some. It's not one conspiracy; it's a whole bunch of them going on at the same time. Because remember, you don't have revolutions or counter revolutions without conspiracies. And then from there, you sort of found, I sort of introduced to the idea that there were secret societies that were involved in this, and the role of espionage and espionage agents who in some cases seem to be doing their their own thing for their own this sort of factor X type of thing is that who's actually working for whom. I mean, is this person working for themselves, or it's like Jeffrey Epstein. Are they doing, is this their own thing, or are they the servant of someone else? So who is actually in control of it? And then that ultimately leads to the whole realm of occultism, which was not something I was initially interested in. But then you find all of these things mixing together in amazing ways, things that you would never sort of think that had any kind of connection to each other. Then, but they do. So crime comes into that. I did do a series for the Great Courses, which is my Secret Society series is part of that, and the Secrets of the Occult is another one. And I did one called Crimes of the Century, which were all about they're all murders. They're all sort of historical homicides, some better known than others, which at one point in time somebody said, this is the crime of the century. I don't know how that held up. And then to examine the different varieties of those. Um, and those run the gamut of things like, the assassination of Trotsky in 1940 was one of those, fairly well known. And then you had a case of, on the other end, you got the Papan sisters, who were these two. Well, you ever heard a sort of story? There's actually a play about this called The Maids. A couple of maids, a couple of female servants who kill their mistress, who get sort of obsessed with this. Well, there's a story behind that, and it has to do in the early 1930s. A couple of rather odd sisters in Paris who work for a wealthy woman, and then at some point brutally murder her and her daughter for reasons that aren't entirely clear. What made them snap in that kind of situation. So it was more an exploration as to looking at these murder cases of what was involved. Why do people kill in those circumstances? It's a crime is one of those things. Have you ever heard of a this is a fictional character, but speaking of crime, there are movies, there's books and movies. Dr. Mabuse.
All right, maybe I'm thinking of the wrong doctor, but there was a doctor that was killing everyone that was in critical condition. So they would get to the end of life and then he would just essentially murder them. And he was one of the most horrendous murderers because he killed hundreds of patients that were very close to death, but he was signing off that they were already dead. Is that?
No, Mabuse is a fictional case. He's created by basically a German writer named Norbert Jacques around 1920. And I don't know exactly where Jacques got the idea for this. That's always kind of interesting. But Mabuse is supposedly his day job is he's a psychologist or a psychiatrist, which means he messes with people's heads. And but what he is he's a kind of criminal mastermind. He's like a Dr. Moriarty in the Sherlock Holmes stories, the Napoleon of crime. Except in Mabuse's case, the whole purpose for organizing, so what he organizes behind the scenes, he uses hypnosis to make people commit crimes, murders, arsons, a whole series of what we now describe as sort of, mass casualty terrorist acts. And again, it comes down to what's the intention of this? Is his intention to gain wealth through doing so? Not really. His whole intention is simply to create chaos. It's to essentially carry out horrific actions that seem to have no actual purpose because they don't actually have any purpose other than to create mass anxiety and terror in the general population. And then that's what in some way he manipulates. He wants to create what he calls an empire of crime that will essentially, through the systematic terrorization of much of the populace, make them vulnerable to other forms of manipulation. The first thing you do is you scare the hell out of everybody. And then once you've got them frightened, then they become much easier to, what were we saying before? Herding them in one direction or another, that fear will do. Why are all those cattle running towards the edge of the cliff? Because they're afraid of something. More afraid of that than the certain death that awaits them at the edge of the cliff. So the whole thing about Mabuse was that, and it was probably most famously turned into a film or two films by the director Fritz Lang, same guy that did Metropolis. And that's probably how it's best known. But it actually starts out in a book. It's turned into a film. Mabuse then becomes this kind of stock character in some way. But the interesting thing to me is that it simply described the concept of someone who was doing evil things simply for the real purpose of simply doing evil things, that they had no greater intent than that, which is a scary idea.
I think there's probably like people like that in the world.
Oh, there certainly are. There aren't a lot of them, but how many does it take? In
Yeah.
this case, it only perhaps takes one. I think in the end, there is some sort of. I'm never sure, or I would question whether or not there's any really such thing as simply evil for the sake of evil. There's always some goal in it, but it may not be. If we always think that crime is about money, that it has something more to do with that. It has to do with, for lack of it has to do with power. And it's, well, you could find that maybe the best expression of that is in George Orwell's 1984, which is a prophetic book in so many ways. So many ways. I don't know what Orwell was tapped into when he wrote that, but it is very interesting to go through the things that have sort of come true about that in many ways. Not the least of which is the constant surveillance of everyone. But there is towards the end of 1984, when the main character Winston Smith is being both tortured and is having explained to his protagonist O'Brien, and O'Brien gives this whole sort of speech about what the whole purpose, what the party is about, the reason this whole system, this whole dystopian system, it's about power. That's all that the party or the people who control this actually want. This is all what it's maintaining is simply power in itself, and that is the greatest goal which one has. Because if you have power, wealth no longer really matters. Power gives you everything. Think of it this way: if you need money, even if you need billions of dollars, then you still are dependent upon that. And to have real power is to no longer be dependent upon any source of income. It's simply to control everything.
But surely you would need to release your identity in order to gain that power. Like when you look at the Zodiac killer, his whole thing was secrecy, right? Nobody knows who he is. So how would he have power over anyone if nobody knew what he actually was?
He knows who he is.
That's the
And I
point.
mean, what did he want? Well, that's always the question. What was his intention? Instilling fear and insecurity in people. And he's never caught, so nobody ever knows what became. So you can come up with all kinds of scenarios that eventually he ended up in a mental institution, he ended up in prison, he died, slipped and fell in the bathtub. At some point, the murders seemed to stop because you really only got 5 canonical killings that could be connected to him. Of course, he's claiming more and more victims all the time. I think, what's the final number? 37, 44, the last sort of claims. Now, he's either claiming that number just to be scary, or there is another possibility. The other possibility, he's being perfectly honest and correct about that. He's just gotten more clever at disguising his killings as something else. And I think in one of his letters, he actually alludes to that they'll appear to be accidents, but they're not accidents. So you've got someone who is clearly playing a mind game with everyone, creating a climate of fear, and for their own satisfaction in some way. Well, that goes back. What did the Zodiac claim this was all about? He was always upfront about that. Why am I doing this? Why am I killing these people? To collect slaves for the afterlife. Literally, that's what he says. I am collecting slaves for the afterlife. Because when I kill these people in this particular way, I own their souls, and when I die, all of them will serve me in the afterlife, which is a not unknown, and other people have had that idea before. Well, here you got what's the reality here? Is he just making up scary stuff to sound scary? Is that what all of this is? Is it his BS, the sort of story which is coming out, or does he really believe this? I'm not saying they're going to be his slaves in the afterlife. That's the point of it. But does he believe that's the case? Is that actually why he's committing the murders, or is that just more scary crap he's throwing out to alarm people? You don't know. Either one is a possibility.
I think it's a bit like the Charles Manson thing. You need to believe your own BS in order to sell it. So maybe he genuinely believes that, because he doesn't strike me as someone that's not intelligent. He's probably hyper intelligent to the fact that he's marginally insane.
Well, see, that's the thing. Intelligent people are the really dangerous ones. That's there's the gradation. There's only so much that genuinely stupid people are capable of. They're just not smart enough to do it. And I think it was Jeffrey Epstein who said that being smart doesn't necessarily make someone good. Probably knew something about that, and that's true. Um, Serial killers are usually quite intelligent, which is how they got into that situation. So it's easily one of those things that, see, it comes down to this idea that knowledge will necessarily make will make you good, make you better. Because if the concept in Freemasonry is to take good men and turn them into better men, that there's this whole process of moral and spiritual advancement in some way. They're becoming a better person. Well, some people don't want to be a better person. They want power, they want wealth, or they want some sort of gratification, and they're not really too concerned about how they do that. And that's the situation which taking someone and educating them, giving them more information and skills, it then still depends upon what their intention is in using that. So you can take the same sort of information and you can use that for good purposes, or you can use it for entirely bad purposes. It all depends what you want out of it. So in that case, the idea that either intelligence or education is any kind of security against evil is completely wrong, because it can just as easily facilitate that. In some cases, by giving a person more information, by giving them more education, you're simply arming them with more and more dangerous weapons to be used against you. Now, it's always be careful what you teach someone how to do.
Hmm. Would you be of the opinion that most serial killers that have got away with it, at least for a long while, are actually of just higher intelligence than the average person? Because I suppose that they've not been caught. But then also, do you think that having a higher intelligence makes you more or less empathetic in some way?
It can be. It gets into a tricky question as to what exactly intelligence is. And my take on that, for what it's worth, I don't know, is that we talk about someone, it's a combination of different things. I think people can be very, very clever in some respects and be pretty dumb in other ones. There's a kind of mixture about that. Um, I would say that I've actually encountered people who probably have well, not probably, they definitely had a very high IQ and could deal with things like higher level math on a level that I could, but they couldn't ride a bicycle. They really couldn't. It's sort of minor, basically physical. They are often, they were just awkward. They couldn't do it. So there's a trade-off. Nature has that way of doing things. Okay, it gives you one thing, it takes away some. Nobody gets all the marbles. Nobody gets all of them. So if you get this, you're not going to get that. The connection between higher intelligence, this set of sort of mental skills of calculations that people can make, is that one of the things that, you know, like I put, one of the things that a smart person at a certain level can catch on to is that they can manipulate stupid people. I don't want to say that it's just pretty smart and stupid, but you can take advantage of them. You can convince them to give you your money. So you can come up with some sort of spiritual gobbledygook and you can get that. That's one way I think of taking advantage of them. And it can then create a certain contempt for average people, because what your experience has taught you is that they're gullible, but they're also, they're just as greedy as you are, but they're not as smart, and you can continually take advantage of them. Therefore, you have no inherent respect for them. I mean, that again, depending on the individual, it could either create sympathy for you. It could create the idea that, well, since I have some sort of greater mental acuity in these areas than they do, that maybe I could use that to help them in some way. But in another person, it could be, I can just use that to take advantage of them, and I should have no sympathy for them because they're just stupid. Therefore, there's no, and I'm just doing what it is. I'm just using the tools that nature or God gave me, and that allows me to go and cheat these people. And I shouldn't feel any particular sympathy for them.
So it's a bit of a superiority complex.
Yeah, you know, you think that you know, you're better than they are, and therefore
Hmm.
you shouldn't feel any particular, and it simply makes it easier not to feel any sympathy for them. There was a person I met once who swore that he was a sociopath. He probably was. I think he was, and he was, by the way, he was very likable. I really liked him, and he was really fun to because he would come up with various things to do. But I completely believed him at one point where he could not really understand the idea of remorse. That seemed to make no, and he couldn't understand why anyone would want that. What was the point of it? You have to do these things. So why do you want to? Why would I want to feel bad about it? It's much easier. It just makes more sense if you don't feel bad about it. You just do what you have to do, and you don't feel bad. I mean, it's the simple thing that here's the basic thing in reality. To basically stay alive, you have to kill something. Now, those are either animals or they're plants, and let's face it, plants are living things. Okay, I'm sure whatever those baby carrots thought they were going to be doing, if they had any thoughts, it was not to become your excrement. But nevertheless, that's what everything will sort of become. So life life lives on death. You have to consume things, and you have to do that. So one argument is, what good does it do you to feel sad about that? What does it accomplish, or should you simply go through with no? Uh, that's an interesting philosophical question that I can't answer. I mean, you're going to have to go through life doing these things. You're going to have to do unpleasant things. You're going to have to kill things. And is it better for you to then have remorse about that, or would it actually be better for it not to affect you at all? I couldn't. And his idea was that it was stupid to have remorse or to feel sympathy in that case, and he couldn't really understand why he would want. He didn't. I don't think he ever really understood what it was, and he couldn't understand. To him, it was just making yourself sad pointlessly. Where he was generally quite happy, and he was a very very cheerful, maniacal person. So there you go.
Yeah, I suppose there's two sides to it. I suppose there's people that don't feel remorse at all to start with, and you get your genuine sociopaths that just do not have that emotion. They don't have any regret. They don't have any of that type of emotion. I suppose it's an interesting question that you asked about. Is it worth feeling that when you eat meat or you eat a carrot that you've killed? I suppose it's a bit like when people get numb to things through constant exposure. So, like, there's the guy, Jordan Belfort from The Wolf of Wall Street, he describes it in a really funny way. He said, when I started getting into all my drugs and cheating on my wife and doing all this horrendous tax avoidance and all that shit, he said it was like dipping my toe in the bath. The first time you dip it in, you pull it out and you think, shit, that's hot. But then all of a sudden, you're fully immersed and you're loving it. And I think it's kind of like that, the constant exposure to something. Like if you were a hunter and you constantly killed deer, I'm sure the first time you killed one, you'd feel bad. But after constant exposure, you just wouldn't feel as bad about it because you've done it so many times.
Well, I guess it all depends. If you have to do it to eat,
Hmm.
okay, if that's a matter of survival, then you'll get used to it fairly quickly.
Hmm.
Um, there's a show that I have to admit I have a guilty affection for. I don't know whether it shows in the UK called Naked and Afraid,
I think I've seen the
and
trailer
it's
for that.
very sad. Okay, I don't know why they had to have people naked, but it's the whole idea of taking people because they blur out all the good parts anyway. So what's the point? Uh, and they go out for 21 days, and they'll usually have some sort of like they get a tin pot, or you can have a mosquito netting. I say always go for the mosquito netting. But and their whole thing is to survive. And you get these kind of interesting collection of people, and you've had people who are like vegetarians or vegans, and they're going to go out and they're going to live in the outdoors, and they're just and there's not there's no supermarket available. There just isn't a collection of food. And the other thing that they find, this is interesting to me, is that most other things, since the world is composed of things that are always eating each other, most things don't want to be eaten and are pretty good at disguising themselves. So you have these guys who think that they're hunters, and they'll go into a situation and there's no game around. Okay, the antelope just doesn't come conveniently in front of you like a target waiting for it, and they can't use any of those skills. So it's really interesting to watch. To me, is that it's and I think this is what I don't know what this means about me. I like watching the cases where you're taking people and you're actually putting them under a great deal of physical and psychological stress. Because very often in this kind of environment where people don't have clothes, even if it's in the jungle, it can get cold. So it's difficult for them to sleep. If there's insects attacking you all night long, or there's all sorts of noises, so they usually get a matter of sleep deprivation, and then some of them just don't eat anything, and then they get weaker and weaker and weaker, and it becomes more difficult to get food. But in other cases, you'll have people who initially start out as being very picky about what they'll eat. So somebody goes, "Well, I'm not going to eat any animals. I'll just nuts and berries. That's the only thing that I'll consume." And then there's not enough nuts and berries. And after 14 days of no food, how does that tend to affect when hunger becomes this thing, which is, and I would say I've never gotten 14 days, but I've been hungry. I mean, where you haven't eaten for an extended period of time, and where it becomes an all-consuming thing. It's the only thing that you're thinking about. You've had no food, you need it, your body knows that you need this, and yet, at a certain point you'll eat anything. And you're going to become much less discriminating about doing that, because it becomes a simply matter that if you don't, you will die. So you're going to have to, whatever nature sort of provides on the menu. That's when they look at these shows. I'm so always amazed how people end up eating snakes. That's the most common food. They're slow. They're poisonous, but if you handle them rightly, you chop the head off. Snakes are kind of slow, and they're low to the ground, and they're fairly easy to catch. And it makes me wonder, is this some sort of human thing that's been going on for hundreds of thousands of years? I mean, have we always been eating snakes that often? I don't know. And they're kind of tasty. So, get some kind of protein out of it. But yeah, it's interesting. You see the transformation of someone who's very picky about what they'll eat, but after 10 days of no food, much less so.
I think when you put someone in that scenario, like a life or death scenario, all the morals begin to go out the window. I'm not sure if you've seen the movie. You'd really like it. I'd highly suggest it. It's called Society of the Snow. Have you seen it?
I don't think so.
It's brilliant. It's so good. So it's a true story. So the whole thing's entirely true, and there's still people alive today that were part of this. What happened? And
is this about the plane crash and cannibalism?
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
It is unbelievable. So you see this young rugby team. I mean, they must be 18 to 26, big, strong lads, and they crash in Argentina in the Andes Mountains.
Yeah.
And they're super high up, and nobody can see the plane because it's white on white. So the search parties can't see the plane. So essentially what starts happening is one by one, they start dying of their injuries from the crash or sickness or whatever it might be. And then quite a few of them are doctors, and they say, listen, if we don't eat within the next couple of days, we're dead. So we either eat what's here, which is the people that have died who are conveniently frozen outside, or we die. And there was this really weird thing that happened, that the first couple of days, everyone didn't talk to each other. Everybody felt horrendous because it was cannibalism. It was so against their nature. But on day 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, all of a sudden it just became normal. And they've actually got genuine photographs that they took themselves of them all smiling, and there's like a person's rib cage beside it that they've just picked clean of all the meat, and the person's leg to one side, and they've tried to cover it with a pillow, but you can see that there's a skull, and it just become normal to them. So I think that the brain normalizes things in order to cope with it, but also if you have repeated exposure to something, it just becomes mundane to you, it just becomes normal to you. It's like the first time you drink alcohol, you want to do it again, but after repeated exposure you're like, I can take it or leave it.
Yeah, well, you get used to what you know what's unique eventually becomes routine in some cases. It's I remember an occasion where someone, this was a person who was a combat veteran, and they always had these sort of questions. I was talking to him, what's it like to kill somebody?
The standard one.
And well, that's the question you always want to ask.
Yeah.
I mean, that's generally the question that is always lurking in the background where someone was in combat. Well, what's it like to kill? Do you kill anybody? What's it like to kill somebody? And you get different responses to that. So the first reaction is relief because this person was trying to kill me. So now they're not. So I'm relieved about that. But I think that the answer that stuck with me the most was the guy who basically said that, well, the thing that it didn't strike him immediately, but that really sort of bugged him was that nothing happened. I mean, nothing changed. And it wasn't just the case of him killing, it was also people around him, his comrades, his friends who were dead. And you've been in this situation where, literally a few minutes before you're all alive, and now you're still alive, and these other people are dead, and you've killed other people in this process. And one of the things that he remembered was it was an absolutely beautiful day. It was this gorgeous day. And it was still the same beautiful day. And that nothing happened, which in other words, there was no. And he thought even some other way that nothing really seemed to happen in him. It was just done. You just done this, and nothing happened. There was no sort of epiphany. You really sort of felt nothing in some way. You had accomplished this. Someone was trying to kill you, and you had killed them, and that immediate threat was ended. But other than that, the thing that got to him was what appeared to be the utter indifference of everything else around you. That the world as a whole, that the sky, nature, everything else took absolutely no notice of anything that had happened. And his sort of feeling about that was that never at any point had he felt so meaningless and insignificant that it sort of messed with his whole sense of how he fit into the thing. And that was sort of his traumatic stress out of that. It wasn't so much the sort of physical horror or anything else. It was just this whole sense of existential meaninglessness that it gave to him. That somehow he expected that there would be some sort of greater thing out of this. That the act of killing would have meant something in some way, and it just seemed to mean nothing. That the day just went on exactly as it would have otherwise. Nothing else was interrupted. And that was the thing that stuck with him and sort of haunted him.
Yeah. Ah, it must be horrible living with something like that. Like the psychological stress of knowing that you've done something that's really wrong, but you did it for the right reasons. When you look at the people that were in Afghanistan and killed in Afghanistan, and then the Americans withdrew from Afghanistan to gain nothing. So what was the point? As a soldier, I'd be thinking like, I've just, skewed my moral compass, committed murder, but although it's war, it's still murder. And then there's not even a gain to it. Like it's not like it was a war that achieved anything.
Well, that's one of the reasons why you have, I think, a great deal of talk in military circles about the mission. Okay, what you have a mission that you're supposed to. That's what you focus on. Everything is to accomplish the mission, and then that mission could be go and kill a group of people, or it could simply to be to evacuate people. But you focus on the mission, and if you've completed your mission, then it's a success. The greater scheme of the war, I mean, ordinary soldiers never have any kind of impact on that. That's always kind of beyond them in some way. And it was I got the first hint of that, I think, years and years ago. I got involved in this project of trying to, again, this probably goes back to the 1970s. And back at that time, there were a lot of First World War veterans that were still alive. A group which is now, I think, entirely extinct. Those people no longer exist. But they were getting older and dying off. So there's an idea of going around and interviewing people. And so you came with these whole kinds of, and the First World War, for some peculiar reason, has always been of odd interest to me, more so than World War II. Oddly enough, I'm much more a World War I guy than the other one. So I would interview some of these guys, and I would, the question was, well, what sort of unit, what division were you in, where were you, what battles were in, and the thing, you could never get much of anything out of them. I mean, part of it is that it was a long time ago. Um, and as one person put it, you're asking me questions about things that I've spent, 45 years trying to forget. So, but most of them, I was in the infantry. They would often sort of remember what regiment that they were in for some reason, because that was a smaller unit. And I think we were somewhere in France, and I could remember the name of this town, but other than that, in many cases, it was just this. I mean, what were they concentrating on? Day-to-day survival. That's what you wanted to do. So you were sent into the line, and you would be there for a certain amount of time, and every day you were there, your life was at risk, and people were being killed around you, and the only thing that you were really fundamentally interested in was surviving, and that's what your focus was on. The strategy, you didn't know. So you'd be told that there's a hill over here, and you're supposed to take this hill. And that again would be the mission. Your mission is to secure that height. What that means in the greater scheme of the war, or whether you win or lose, is that's completely beyond your control. What you want to do is to secure that piece of ground and not die.
So it's just, I suppose in these people's minds, it's just going from one thing to the next in terms of like, I remember speaking to one of these guys that we had a gentleman called Brian Wood on the podcast, and he was in the military, and he fought at the Battle of Danny Boy. It's quite a famous fight. Have you heard of it?
Of Danny Boy, no.
Yeah, it was the Battle
Which
of
war
Danny
was
Boy.
that?
It was in Afghanistan.
Ah, okay. All
It,
right.
it was in Afghanistan, so it was a lot more recent. But essentially, there was this really horrendous battle that broke out, and they had to run through open ground. So they had to leapfrog, and there was only 4 of them, and they were leapfrogging through open ground whilst getting shot at. And when he came back, he explained that when your mind is operating at that level for weeks, months on end, just high adrenaline, high impact, just what's on the other side of the door, knock the door down, right, next. You can only think 1 or 2 steps ahead. But when you come back to normal life, and then you've all of a sudden got a tax bill, and you haven't paid your electricity, have you paid your Sky, have you set up the Wi-Fi, have you done that? And he said it was just like overwhelming to him. And that's why a lot of the SES and army and military get into extreme sports, because they want to push the only thing within that moment that they can think of is how to survive the next step, because it's so extreme. Skydiving's a good example. And I think that's like when you go to these extreme places and the only thing you can think of is what is next, it actually changes your mind in some kind of way, that you need to operate at a higher level, and you don't feel alive as such unless you're doing that. I think that's like a genuine thing that goes on in people's brains.
I think part of it is a kind of physical addiction. And because in those kinds of stress, you're basically dosed with a combination of 2 things. You're getting adrenaline, and then you're also getting a lot of endorphin, and you're getting this kind of speedball in a way, and that can become it's exhilarating. Um, it is, and it's another the comment you'll come across people. The combat, as scary as it is you'll never find anything more exhilarating than that. And and people who do things that really like to risk their lives doing something. Um, Climbing Mount Everest, I suppose, is some example of that. See, again, something I just don't get. I'm gonna I'm gonna spend $60,000 to go off and go through this whole process, and the end prize in this is to stand on top of a mountain, which I admit is cool and all. It would be, but I it wouldn't be value return on investment for me. I don't. It's just not that. It's an interesting view. Maybe it's all cloudy, but you also stand a very high risk of dying just to get a good view. So that's not. I think ultimately what it suggests to me is that it's not really about getting to the top of the mountain. It's the whole process. It's being able to say that you did it in some way. But people will risk their lives for what often appear to be pointless things. I knew a guy once, this goes back even further. This was like high school. He was somewhat older, but his whole thing was he would take his car out, he'd be driving it around. And what he could do is he could take his steering wheel off. It wasn't, he was on the column, but he could just pull it off. So he'd go out and he'd drive, and he'd, other people are, and then he would just do that. He would just pull off the steering wheel and hand it to the person next to him. And he could still kind of grip the steering wheel, but it would just absolutely scare the bejesus out. I mean, you didn't know what was going. There's no steering wheel in this car. We're out of control. And that was really, he thought that was fun, but he liked risking his life, and that he actually did go into the military, and he went into demolitions because he liked playing with explosives. He liked blowing shit up. That was his thing. That's what he had always done. He would blow things up, and then he got a job where he got to blow things up. And that was, I think he survived that as far as I know. He came in that process. But it was really sort of what appeared, just risking his life for just the sort of sheer thrill of that. Um, Another thing that sort of reminded me, I mean, this sort of context, the whole thing about killing and whatnot, is that I've also had people remark that, once you've done it, you kind of realize how easy it is to do, and that you don't, that it's sort of, I think there's a huge sort of psychological barrier to doing that, which I think is pretty much ingrained into it. But, once, again, if you've done it and nothing happens, then you can do it again. And that was I think people can deal with that on different ways. For some people that may become a disincentive, but for others it can just become an easy way for settling disputes.
When you were interviewing your gentlemen from World War One, did any of them mention like the psychological impact that had on them in terms of killing, or was it more of a block? They just push it down to the bottom of their brain, and it's
Very few of them would talk about that. And it's not to say that everybody in that situation, you've got some people who their whole career was being a typist somewhere,
hmm.
but they're generally talking about people who, been at the front. For most of them, it was just, it was focused on staying alive, eating. Okay, food was very important. Um, Probably the most interesting guy that I interviewed he was the shrink of a coworker of mine. So I don't know, she was seeing a shrink, and she goes, "Oh, well, my psychiatrist, he was a German army veteran in the First World War, so he'd probably be willing to talk to you. And now keep in mind, this guy's a psychoanalyst. He's a Jungian psychoanalyst. So his first question when I come to interview him was why I was interested in doing this. So he goes, well, there's some reason why you're interested in doing this. But he was an interesting character, but he really wasn't interested in talking about it. He goes, well, have you ever read All Quiet on the Western Front? And I go, yeah. And he goes, well, you got it. Okay. You want to know what my experience was? Everything but the last page in that book. That was my experience. I didn't die. That's it. Read it. There's nothing more I can add to that. But he did have this thing, which I can't say it made a big impression on me at the time, but it has since. And he goes, well, there's really only one thing I saved from that. There's only sort of one memento that I have from it. He goes, I got medals. I don't know what happened to them. I was never interested in them. I gave them away, threw them away, or whatever. But I go, I do have this one thing. And what it was that he'd shot a guy, he'd killed a man. Who was a British soldier or officer, and he'd shot him. And he could remember shooting him, and he goes, when I shot him, he sort of jumped like a rabbit. That's the only thing I can, because I'd hunted rabbits before, and he dropped. And then we would do what was, one of the things that often happens that people don't talk about that much, is going through the bodies. You're looking for stuff. In his cases, they were looking for, what was it? Was it chocolates? And, whatever it was that they had, because the German army at this point was short of food. Allied troops are better, so you would go, but you would just go through and see what you could find. So he said he got into the pocket of this guy, and there was like a waterproof container, an oilskin type of thing. So there was something fairly important in that. And looking for maps, whatever you could find. And so this guy had this thing in this inner pocket, and it was in this waterproof pouch, and he pulled it out, and it was just a piece of paper. And it's an interesting type of thing, because all that was on this piece of paper, which he showed to me, is an outline of a small hand in sort of red crayon. And you can see that basically a child has put their hand down, and they trace their hand on it. And it just has the words written under it. And see, Daddy, see, I'm this big. And it's interesting that was the one thing that he saved. And I think because it had a real sort of impact on him. So he actually had an interesting way of describing that. He said, that's my ticket to hell. So.
Yeah, that's heartbreaking. Heartbreaking, but for both of them. I mean, because if you, like, in any other scenario, they would have probably been friends or acquaintances. They would have had a drink at a bar together. But purely because you have two bigwigs at the top of Germany and UK going, you go to war, they send all the young boys off to war, and they have to do that. It's heart-wrenching. It like truly is. You can't imagine how many people that's happened to as well. It's weird that so many people talk about the second. I feel like partially because some of them are still alive, but a lot of people talk about the Second World War. But the First World War to me seems so much more like horrendous, like grisly. You had people running into German machine guns, and if they turned around, they'd get shot. Like, it just seems to me like it was a lot more, not saying the Second World War wasn't gruesome, but I think the First World War was more grisly than the second. Does that make sense?
It's sort of the first really industrialized war. I mean, you have the sort of application of technology to it. And otherwise, in just sort of overall pointlessness, you it's still not clear in any way that there was anything that was terribly necessary about it. It's not even clear in some ways of what it was about. I mean, the interesting thing about the first here's an interesting distinction between in history of terms between facts and that most of history being opinion. So it is a fact that the First World War or the Second World War occurred. Okay? There was this huge conflagration, and it's a fact as to what countries were involved, and it's a fact on what day they, and even to some degree the casualties are fact. You can come up with all of these numbers and these things that happen. But the opinion is why any of this happened. I mean, why? What are the exact causes of it? And that's where you just get different opinions. Well, it was this, or there were those reasons. It was all balance of power, or it was greed and fear that caused these things to happen. And I don't think there's any single explanation that explains any. It's just that a series of things happened, of events that took place. There's a kind of events tend to build on top of each other. And you often get results that I would say that I think one of the most important elements in all of human history is the law of unintended consequences. That you do things with the goal of achieving a particular end. But you've changed a variable, or you've introduced a variable by doing this. And what we don't appreciate is that all of these things are connected to each other. And that if you alter one variable, you have unknowingly altered a whole variety of others, so that you will never get the exact result you wanted. You have now created unintended consequences. And that's easy to find just in everyday life. This is why things never quite work out the way that you do, because you think you're doing one thing, but you've now also changed something else, and it's not going to work. So, and I think, the First World War is as much a result of the law of unintended consequences that you get elsewhere. I mean, here's the thing to sort of puzzle over. The whole thing begins in this spat over the assassination of an Austro-Hungarian archduke in Bosnia by a Serbian terrorist nationalist. Those are the only people who were involved in this. The Austrians and the Serbs, all right? So that's it, okay? And but then, over a series of actions with unintended consequences, you now end up with Britain, France, Russia, and Germany, who are not involved in this initial thing at all. That's what it becomes about. And, you wake up one morning and you're now involved in a war over something that initially had nothing really all that much to do with you, that might have been settled in any number of ways. I mean, the 19th century Europeans, they got pretty good in holding conferences to settle things. I don't know, let's all get together and hash things out, divide up Africa, whatever we're going to do. But it could have been, there was nothing there that couldn't have been settled by some form of negotiation. But at some point, I guess we're not going to do that. I don't think it's anything that anybody planned. It just happened.
Yeah, I think it's a genuine thing as well. I think it can spiral. And especially when people don't talk to each other, because then you just get like a Cold War effect, like a standoff, because nobody will talk about things, and then because they won't talk, the issues become bigger, and then they grow, and then they grow, and then there's an explosion, and then all of a sudden it settles again. That seems to be the way that society goes. It's like there's a fight, a conflict, then they stop speaking, they both manipulate their sides of the pond to say why the other's shit and why the other's bad. The tensions rise, there's an explosion, there's a war, and then everything settles again. That seems to be the common theme. And it's sad that we haven't recognized that pattern, and we haven't learned from it. Because like, if you just look at history, you can probably figure out what to do in the situation, but we just don't tend to do it.
The bottom line of all this is human beings are strange creatures. I don't know. It was a I'd have to say that I may have said this in the Friedman podcast, but When I was about 17 or 18, I actually thought I had things figured out pretty well. You know, things seem, yeah, I think I got things figured out. Nothing figured out. Now, in my 70s, it makes no sense at all. I don't know. I can't, I no longer make any pretense of trying to figure things out because there isn't any figuring things out. It isn't some sort of puzzle that you can just solve. There isn't any particular solution to it. Things happen. And as a result, okay, here's the way. Things happen. And as a result of those things happening, other things happen. And then those cause other things to happen, which then cause other things to happen. And it just cascades that way on and on and on. It's just this sort of cause and effect, cause and effect, cause and effect, cause and effect, without any other actual, not necessarily for any particular purpose. I don't know. Maybe there is some grand purpose to it. Maybe, but can't prove it. Can't prove there isn't one either, I suppose. But it's, I think one of the things that Friedman actually started with, I said it actually later in our interview, but he sort of put it up in front of it, was that, most people most of the time are nice and cooperative. Most interactions with people are, they're formulaic, but you're pleasant to other people because that's just the easiest way of getting along. If you walk in and you're aggressive and surly, it's immediately going to create problems. It's going to obstruct you getting what you want. So say please and thank you. You don't have to mean it, just say it. And it makes things so much easier. And so people are cooperative and pleasant most of the time until at some point they're not. You know, you might have had, this is the roommate experience. Roommate seems perfectly normal until one day you realize you're living with a crazy person. Personally, the roommates I had always seemed to be fairly normal, but I've had other people who've had terrible experiences with that. I've seen that happen. The crazy roommate. They didn't seem crazy to begin with. They just went crazy off on something. And it's there's also that the guy who has something to say about everything, Winston Churchill, who had his own problems. They said something to the effect that everybody is a little mad about something. Now, you get somebody that there's some particular issue, something or other that someone loses all rationality about. That they enter into this realm of temporary insanity over that, and you can get them into that's where they suddenly become the person who would become completely reasonable and rational and pleasant now becomes crazy because you enter their crazy zone. You've provoked that in some way, and so that comes back to this idea of intention. So you always have to, got to be careful with people. Be nice, say please and thank you, but you never know when they're going to go off on you. So it's just the way it is.
What was Lex Friedman like?
It's very pleasant. It's just him. There's no. I thought there was going to be like a crew of some kind or another. It's just him, and the studio's just like in his living room, one end of the room, and you just sit and talk, and that was very nice.
I really love his podcasts. I think he's a really kind of he's a hyper intelligent guy, and you can kind of tell. But he's very inspirational to me in terms of the way he hosts, and he allows his guests the freedom to speak, and he doesn't interject. And he's very. I really like his interview style. I think it's really nice.
Yeah, I certainly had a sense that I enjoyed that, and that I was having a conversation with somebody. But that's pretty much what it was like. And that's the best thing to do: put people at ease and just let them talk.